Kentucky, Andy Beshear. It's great to have you here in person. Governor, you heard Vice President Harris there. She's just made it here to Chicago. How is this convention going to look different than the one that we saw from Republicans just a few weeks ago?
Well, you were going to see excitement and you were going to see joy. I just got here today, but I'm already fired up and ready to go. You see this backdrop behind us, which is incredible. We're going to fill up an arena that normally watches the Bulls, but you're seeing these crowds all over America turning out for the Vice President and for Tim Walz. They are a team of hope. They're a team of optimism. They're about turning the page and moving us forward and never ever going back.
Well, and the sense of moving forward and that spirit that Harris has been trying to capture on the campaign trail. You know, tomorrow night on that stage at this time, President Biden is going to be speaking in a very different speech than we thought it would be a month ago when he was supposed to speak on Thursday, obviously at his convention. How does your party balance, honoring him, talking about what he's done, but also not looking too far back to where voters clearly were unhappy with?
Well, President Biden is a great president and a great American, and he was really good to me in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. You look at the Brent Spence Companion Bridge, one of the largest infrastructure grants in U.S. history, came to Kentucky and Ohio, even though those states didn't vote for him. He's been out there being a president for everyone, showing up after natural disasters in Kentucky, going to my dad's hometown after 70% of every structure was wiped out in an F4 tornado.
Yeah.
He deserves this first night. He deserves to talk about his legacy. I mean, I've never in my lifetime had a president that decided not to run for a second term. And so this is an amazing act of patriotism. I think he looked at the numbers and he put his country in front of himself. But I think he's going to do it instead of anyone else having to. I think you're going to hear him talk about the great work that he and his team have done. But I think you're going to hear him talk about how his vice president is ready, about how her policies can build on top of his, and about how she's going to lead us forward to a better place where we're not always clashing, where it's not always red or blue, Democrat or Republican, where we can get back to being Americans first and everything else second or third.
It's got to be bittersweet for him, I imagine.
Oh, probably. But you know what? He's got to be president of the United States, which many people, not many people in history have. And when you look back on his legacy, this decision is going to secure it. It's going to be about the work he did while he was in office. And you look at the two biggest battery plants on planet Earth that we're building in Kentucky, that wouldn't happen without his policies in place.
Well, and you're a Verdi yourself. You're a Democratic governor in a very red state that has no risk of turning blue in the presidential election. I think Donald Trump won in 2020 there by about 500,000 votes. But when you hear speakers on that stage this week, obviously they'll be talking to everyone who's in the United Center. But how do you want them to appeal to moderate suburban voters, people who are your constituents?
I want them to talk about what people worry about at the beginning of every day. Because when folks wake up, they're not thinking about the presidential election or the latest poll. They're thinking about their job and whether they make enough to support their family. They're thinking about their next doctor's appointment for themselves, their parents, or their kids. They're thinking about the roads and bridges they're going to drive that day and what traffic's going to be like going to work. They're thinking about the school they drop their kids off at, and they're thinking about public safety in their community. Yes, there are other critical issues and causes we need to talk about, but living and governing where people are every day lifts everyone up. And people are so hungry for somebody who's not just for their people or bent on revenge or wanting to continue this us versus them. They're hungry for a better world and a better country.
Yeah, well, we've been looking at the numbers, and on a lot of the issues that are the most important to voters, the economy, inflation, Harris is trailing Trump based on where the numbers stand right now. I mean, if you look at what is coming out from people today, you see that on the economy, he's got 46%, she's at 37%, inflation 45 to 36. Does she need to start putting daylight between herself and President Biden on those issues to make up ground with voters?
Well, I believe that her economic policy that came out today is a great compliment to President Biden's. President Biden's economic policy was about building a sustainable future economy. It was about reshoring our supply chain and investing in areas like chips and EV batteries, which are really industries of the future. Her policies are about right now, helping Americans have that bridge to that future economy. So think about home ownership, about increasing the supply and building more affordable housing, and helping to make sure it's more affordable, more tax credits for the middle class and those raising children. And of course, making sure that companies aren't taking advantage of us and that real supply and demand is going on, as well as capping prescription drug costs, something that we all worry about. So So when you look at her policy, I don't think it's necessarily daylight. It's having this great future forward plan that President Biden put out, and then having the what we need right now, which Vice President Harris has put out.
And part of her economic plan, she also wanted to have a federal ban on price gouging. Do you support that?
Well, I do, because we've got those in our states. As Attorney General, I've brought those. We made a big recovery when our people were gouged in terms of gasoline. You look at her being a previous AG, and this isn't rocket science. And it's not any type of price fixing. It's about making sure that capitalism works by having guardrails. Teddy Roosevelt showed us how important that is when he broke up some of the earliest monopolies. And you've still got to go to court. You've still got to prove it. So this is just taking something the states, including Texas, have done and moving it to the federal level too.
Yeah, but it's already illegal. Price fixing is already illegal in most states, including in Kentucky.
Yes, but you've got to be able to bring the action. It takes time, and having a separate federal action that could cover all 50 states can be an important tool in the toolbox of making sure we're looking out for our citizens.
But is price gouging happening right now from major grocery stores? I mean, Kroger obviously reigns supreme in Kentucky. Do you think that they're engaging in price gouging?
And Kroger's been a great partner of ours. I don't see that. But when those things occur, I've certainly seen gouging after natural disasters, and in other instances, having a 50-state option can be really important. It can also give a president and vice president leverage that they need at critical times to make sure the American people are treated right. That's all this is about, making sure we're treated right.
I'm glad you brought this up, though, because this has been one of the biggest issues that Republicans have hit Vice President Harris on. We heard from Senator J.D. Vance, Donald Trump's running mate, on this today in an interview on Fox News earlier. This is what he had to say.
Giving Kamala Harris control over inflation policy, Shannon, it's like giving Jeffrey Epstein control over human trafficking policy. The American people are much smarter than that.
For this guy to mention Jeffrey Epstein when he has encouraged women to stay in relationships with domestic violence, and when he called someone getting impregnated through rape as inconvenient, is really something.
I mean, but do you think that was just trying to be sensational to make a point about inflation, or what do you think?
I think he tries to be sensational a lot. But listen, the Attorney General of Texas has brought price gouging lawsuits. So again, this isn't anything new. It's something that's been practiced in the states. And yes, the president is going to have at least some control out there. She should be our next president. We've seen what Donald Trump's trade policies have done. They resulted in a huge tariff on bourbon in my state, which severely impacted a number of companies, could have impacted employment, but thankfully Gina Raimondo, when she became the Commerce Secretary, was able to undo those harmful tariffs.
But what about when we hear from Jason Furman, obviously who worked in the Obama administration, a top economist, and he said he actually thinks that a policy like that would do more harm than good?
Well, that sounds like an economist. Here in the real world, I've seen what price gouging is, what it does, and how our people can be harmed. And again, this isn't supply and demand. That will happen. And sometimes it will happen even when it's tough on the American people. But you and I both know there are times where companies say, we're going to bleed every nickel out of this situation, and in those instances, we need these types of laws to step in.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of people have pushed back on that plan and said it's just simply supply and demand and the supply chain and what that looks like. Overall,
but that works itself out in court. You actually have to go to court and prove that it's more than supply and demand. And
yeah, it took you 12 years for one of your biggest ones. I know you did. I'm sure you remember that very well.
I remember exactly how long it took.
But when it comes to this convention overall, and as people are watching this, I mean, this is something that has been a moment, as we talked about, that was unexpected a month ago. Harris is trying to introduce herself to people. She's not as well known as to politicos and to people who watch her very closely. What is the most important thing that you think she needs to do when she speaks on Thursday night?
Well, I think she needs to be herself, not who she's been made out to be. You know, she is smart and strong, which will make her a good president, but she also is kind and has empathy, which will make her a great president and makes her the diametric opposite of Donald Trump. You have one person that's running because they believe in America and they care about people, and that's Kamala Harris, and you have another that's bent on revenge. I mean, this is like your angry uncle who gets up during Thanksgiving dinner and goes on a tirade, and we all politely ignore it, except now he's running for president. I mean, we must make sure that we have leaders that have empathy, that lead with kindness, and I think you're just going to see something very different in her speech.
What do you make of him calling her Comrade Kamala, which is his latest nickname for her?
I think he's a bully that tries to come up with names to call people, and that's pretty sad from a former president who wants to be president again.
Governor Andy Beshear, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Nice having you in person.
Yes.
And ahead we have much more.